In President Trump and Elon Musk's joint interview last night with Fox News Channel's Sean Hannity, the president shared that he wouldn't make cuts to Medicaid, the federal state health insurance program that mostly covers poor Americans, but making substantial cuts to Medicaid is a key part of the congressional Republicans' plan to extend the tax cuts. So how will Republicans resolve this apparent clash between the White House and congressional Republicans? Here now with all the latest reporting on this story is Lindsey McPherson, who is Washington Times Capitol Hill reporter. She joins us from Capitol Hill. Lindsey, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so first, remind us when the federal government is scheduled to run out of money to spend when this current continuing resolution ends.
So government funding runs out on March 14th, and they're trying to negotiate a new funding deal with Democrats at the moment, separate from the party line reconciliation bill that you've been talking about. But that deadline is fast approaching.
So are the two going to collide at some point, or are they going to be able to work on separate tracks?
They're definitely on separate tracks procedurally. Certainly the deadline of the government funding bill will put some pressure on them as we're hoping to use a lot of that time to move their party line or their bill through the party line budget reconciliation process. So they'll collide in the sense that they'll be competing for floor time and attention, but they have to be on separate tracks because government funding cannot be passed through but the budget reconciliation process. The rules wouldn't allow that because that's discretionary spending.
Right.
And the budget reconciliation process only allows for mandatory spending.
I think what I'm by colliding, I mean, might we see Democrats holding up one to try to influence the other?
I think Democrats will have other things that they're going to be demanding as part of the government funding negotiations related to asserting the congressional power of the purse in light of the Department of Government Efficiency and the things they've been cutting around the federal government. I don't think they would use the government funding bill to kind of protest the reconciliation bill, if that makes sense.
All right. So let's talk about that reconciliation bill. The Senate moving forward with a smaller, look like a two-bill approach. The House declaring that they're going forward with the one big, beautiful bill next week, and they won't take up the Senate bill. How are things looking there on Capitol Hill with the House out this week, but Senate working?
Right, so the Senate, is moving ahead. As you said, they told us they had lunch with the Vice President J.D. Vance today after Trump had endorsed the House bill, the House budget, and said he wants both chambers to adopt the House budget. They left the lunch with Vance saying that they still plan to move ahead with their budget as kind of a plan B. They view it as a totally backup option, trigger in case needed, in case the House can't get the votes to pass its own budget. So they just want to keep the process moving. They're worried about the House. They have a small majority there, getting enough votes to pass the broader plan. And that's why they decided to move ahead. But they're not excluding if the House is successful in being able to pass their own budget and supporting that plan. They do have some concerns about how it deals with the tax cut extension. We can talk about that if you like. But they're viewing their Senate budget as more of a plan B.
I actually want to dive into something you've written about, and that is the Medicaid cuts. The president said there'll be no Medicaid cuts. Some Republicans are saying to reach the $1.5 trillion mark over the next 10 years in cuts and move forward with the president's tax cuts, there's going to have to be some modifications to Medicaid. Now, that's not been fully explained by most in the media, that what the Biden administration did and enticing states to be more generous in Medicaid is basically a 90-10 match. So we're talking about able-bodied people in many cases. So what's being proposed, if I'm not mistaken, Lindsey, are kind of modest cuts to Medicaid and pushing more of the responsibility onto the states.
Right. I guess basically the House budget resolution calls for $875 billion in cuts from the Energy and Commerce Committee and they have jurisdiction over Medicaid. A lot of Republican lawmakers do not see them being able to meet that target without touching Medicaid. As Trump has said, he doesn't want to touch Medicaid. But my understanding from what the president really wants is he doesn't want to touch Medicaid benefits. What Republicans are saying they can do to find savings is what you talked about, that 90-10 formula from the Obamacare expansion, where if states opted into the Obamacare expansion, the federal government had committed to paying 90% of the cost of Medicaid, and the state's paying 10%. They want to look at adjusting that. And there are a bunch of proposals on the table for how they might adjust that. But basically, yes, they want to find savings by kicking more of the responsibility to the state, whether that's capping it at the number, capping the cost at the number of beneficiaries, or doing block grants to limit the state funding. That's kind of the ideas that they're looking at.
And that wouldn't be the first time that the federal government did that. I mean, I go back even when I was in the state legislature in Louisiana, where we had the disproportionate funding and the federal government adjusted the formula and the state had to come up with more money. So this is, they entice states to expand these benefits. And then, at a certain point, they got to pay for them.
Right. So, yeah, we'll see what they end up with. I think that Republicans are in agreement that, the states could contribute more, and that they, take more ownership over this, and it shouldn't all fall on the federal government. Exactly how to get there is kind of where the policy disagreements lie, and a lot of details still to be worked out. But they are just at this first stage of setting the overall targets for spending cuts, not necessarily having to identify the details until they adopt that budget.
So next week, the House returns, and when they left town last week, the plan was to move the bill this coming week. Do you think they're going to be there?
That is still the plan. I think at this point that they still have some work to do to convince some of kind of the debt hawks that, the cuts as outlined in the resolution, they call for like at least 1.5 trillion in cuts, but they set a goal to go higher to 2 trillion, and that kind of can go even higher than that if they want, but just kind of that to appease the debt hawks, that to convince them that it's enough is not kind of shored up yet. But that's, I think, something that the leaders are working on over the recess in anticipation of members coming back. And I think that's part of why the Trump endorsement came out for that approach, is to try to help convince the skeptical members, as having the president weigh in favor of it, I think, could carry some weight there.
Well, we'll see soon enough when they return next week. Lindsey McPherson, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you today.
Thanks, Tony.